Good evening and welcome to the Trust's Origins and Influences lecture series. A technical formality to begin, if you could silence your cell phones since we're recording the lecture this evening. We open the 2014 season with a lecture by Christian Witt-Dörring. Christian is a leading expert on Viennese architecture and design. He specializes in the history of furniture and interiors, concentrating in particular on the 19th and 20th centuries. From 1974 to 2004, he was head of the furniture collection at the Austrian Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. He currently works as a freelance art historian in Vienna and consulting curator at the Neue Gallery, New York. In addition to holding teaching positions and delivering numerous lectures on art and art historical themes, he's curated many important exhibitions on leading figures in Viennese art and design. From the 1979 exhibition, Vienna in the Age of Schubert, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, through to 2013's Koloman Moser, Designing Modern Vienna, 1897 to 1907, at the Neue Gallery. Please join me in welcoming Christian Witt-Dörring.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak in Chicago. I consider Chicago to be like my second home. I spent one of my most important formative years in 1986 at the Art Institute, so I feel very strongly about Chicago. And any chance to come here, I welcome. So what I'm going to do, what I'm going to show you today is, since David told me that Frank Lloyd Wright came to Vienna in 1910, I want to show you what Frank Lloyd Wright might have been able to see design-wise and architecture-wise in Vienna in 1910. We don't know exactly when during the year he was in Vienna. We know from one remark he made at a lecture in 1929 that he admired the work of Otto Wagner, the father of modernism in Vienna. And then he mentions, of course, Joseph Maria Olbrich, the architect of the Secession building, and very strangely, the other person he mentions is Franz Metzner, whom you might never have heard of before. He is a sculptor. And you will find out why he was interested in Franz Metzner. Also, very strangely, he doesn't mention Hoffmann or Lohse at all. Lohse, I think, because by 1910, Lohse had not built anything big yet. He had done some shops, designed the American bar, and that's what I'm going to show you also. But none, for example, the famous Michaela house, the house without eyebrows, as it was called, was not built yet. So when Frank Lloyd Wright came to Vienna in 1910, Vienna was the center of, and the capital, the residence of a multinational empire of nearly 60 million people. Of nearly 60 million people, the city itself had 2 million inhabitants, a number that we haven't reached today yet again. This is just to show you the distribution of, as they call it then, races. We wouldn't call these races anymore today. We call it ethnicities. For example, the laws of Austria were published in 11 different languages. Or, for example, this is the Pledge of Allegiance of the Austrian soldier to the Austrian emperor, again, in 11 languages. And you can imagine it's hard to control an army, you know, if you don't speak a common language. And you know the outcome of World War I, which, you know, we cannot say celebrate this year, but commemorate. This is this display at the Museum of the Austrian Army in Vienna, in a vitrine. And whenever I see this, I'm really deeply moved, you know, these 11 languages. And this is an important aspect of Vienna 1900, that this is a multinational culture, because the whole period, not only in Austria, but in the whole Western world, it's about national consciousness, because it has to do with identity. To me, it's, I don't know if this is politically correct again, but it's the most primitive way to become an individual, or to get an identity. So Otto Wagner, he really is the most important figure in changing design and architecture in Vienna 1900. He's born in 1841, he dies in 1918, like so many of the great artists because of the Spanish flu. Klimt dies in the same year, Schiele dies in the same year, and Koloman-Moser dies in the same year in 1918. So Wagner, in a way, had the luck that he started his architectural career at the moment when Vienna, he was at the right spot at the right time. Vienna became a megalopolis. How do you say it? Megalopolis, yeah. In the second half of the 19th century. It was in the late 1850s that the emperor decided to knock down the medieval walls so that the city can expand. And I'm just show you a map of Vienna from the 1850s. And this was the center of town with the imperial residence and the walls, and then an empty area around it so you could defend the city, and then all the suburbs. And by decreeing that the walls should be knocked down, the city could expand, and new, especially architectonic opportunities existed. Wagner in 1893 became, was, how do you say, named responsible for artistic aspects of Vienna's urban development. And I don't know who of you have been to Vienna, but you might be familiar with the metro system, the Stadtbahn, and it's because of that that Wagner designed the whole metro system in Vienna. He also designed what is called Generalregulierungsplan. It's a big city development plan in 1893 for 3 million people, believing that the city would grow that fast. I just give you a few numbers so that you see how this city attracted people from all over the empire, not only the empire, but also from the Reich, from Germany. By 1859, that's when the walls came down, it had 470,000 people. 1869, 600,000. 1890, over 1 million. And in 1910, over 2 million people. And Wagner addresses this growth by doing his urban planning, which he, by just another thing so that you get an idea what it meant for the city, that it really changed the whole scene, and also it must have been drastic for people, because what we can see in the foreground are the little houses that still existed, and they were somehow swallowed by the modern city. And by 1911, Wagner realized that his plan of 1894 was too small in thinking, and he drew a new plan in 1911 for a megalopolis of 4 million people. And just an idea, to give you an idea, this was his design for a new 22nd district on the other side of the Danube. It's also then the time when the Danube was being integrated into the city, because the Danube was only regulated, can you say regulated? In the 1860s. Before that, it was a broad area of little rivers and branches, and it would flood regularly, so you could not build in that area. So Wagner is so important because he's the first one to say we have to break away from the eclectic style. But what's also important is, and it's very, I mean, I feel very strong about this, is since I was educated with a modernist worldview, and the modernist worldview always needs an enemy to exist or justify itself. So for the modernists, the eclectic period is just bad, you know, and the modern is good. But it was really fascinating when I went through postmodernism with the postmodernist experience, you suddenly start to see differently. It's interesting, the information is always there, but it always depends on your priorities, on your values, what dimension of the information you are able to read or what not. And so, after going through the postmodern virus, or whatever you call it, I suddenly read the sources differently. And for example, the secessionists, they never said we're against old art. They said, we are not for new art, we are not against old art, we are for art. Huh? And whom do they elect for their first president, honorary president? The 80-year-old painter Rudolf von Alt, the epitome of a Biedermeier painter. And what they are looking for is, I mean, the concept of, can you say, concept of tradition is something extremely important for the people then. And again, you know, for modernists, tradition equals conservative. But not for these people then. They look at tradition as something to be able to lock onto a quality that was lost. And so, for example, you might be familiar with what Gustav Mahler says. He says, tradition is not the admiration of the ashes, but the carrying over of the fire, or carrying on of the fire. And in that context, you have to see it. So, for example, again, there's a drawing of, I don't know if it, we'll see, of Wagner, where he represents his ideas for the metro system, and he frames it with all the names of the eclectic period architects. He wouldn't do that if he hated it. He saw that this was quality. Anyway, he comes out of that period. He's born in 1841. But what he says, and that's what's so important, he says the eclectic style is not zeitgemäß, up to date for our modern society, for modern technology. And so he says we need to find an up-to-date formal expression that reflects also the new democratic bourgeois, bourgeois you cannot say in English, civil or, it's very difficult to find a term for bürgerlich in English, civil style. And so he says, we have gas heating, we have a telephone. It makes no sense to have a telephone in a Gothic style or a gas heater in Renaissance shapes. And just as an example, and we get all these publications at the time which somehow say the good and the bad, you know? So this is the bad on the left and that's the good on the right. So Wagner comes out of the neo-Renaissance in Vienna, and already in the 80s he says, okay, the Renaissance is a wonderful style because it's a style that clearly distinguishes between Lord Baring and Lord Caring. And so he starts as a neo-Renaissance architect, but then he says, okay, but we need to change because we approach modern times, and so the new style should be the free Renaissance, as he calls it. And so just to explain to you where he comes from, where he goes to, 1877 on the left, and then 1882, 1883, and that is what he would call the free Renaissance. And what's free about it, look at the proportions, for example. Also, Wagner is to me is interesting because he introduces a new element into Viennese architecture, and this is monumentality, which is not really part of the mentality in Vienna. And especially, for example, you know the Ringstrasse, the big boulevard, which is real with all the monumental buildings, but this street can never develop monumentality because it curves. Huh? So it's not like the Champs-Élysées, you know. And then by 1898, in 1894, he gets the chair of architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And he, before that already, in the late 1880s, he says the new style needs to be a Funktionsstil, Nutzstil, a style of utility or of utility. And that's something very, very new, that the style is being explained not through shape, but through function. At least you have the same tradition here, you know, with Sullivan. But for us over there, it's new, and he is a hero in that sense for us. So in 1894, he gets this chair of architecture, and he writes a theoretical book, which is called Modern Architecture. And this book becomes like the Bible for the modern in Austria, and not only in Austria, but for the whole of Central Europe. And since he's teaching architecture, a lot of the architects from the Crown lands come to Vienna, and like that, the new style can disperse into Central Europe. And in this Bible, he gives us something like a recipe for the modern style, how you get to the modern style. These 4 points. First, you define the function of the object or the architecture you need to design. Secondly, you define the material that is most purpose-oriented to execute this function. Thirdly, the technique, how to execute it. And then the fourth, and that's the very modern to me, is he says the form runs out of, evolves by its, rinnt aus der Feder, runs by itself out of your pen. Huh? So it's very different from what we will see with the secessionists, that there's first the artistic concept of the shape and then the function. While with him, the form comes last. And that's how he becomes really the big hero for Adolf Loos, whom he can accept. So these are the first so-called modern buildings in Vienna, the first modern buildings of Wagner in 1898. These are apartment buildings, and what's new for Vienna is there's no more hierarchical distinction between the different floors. And Wagner says, we have elevators now, so all the floors are equal. It's just one example of his thinking. Or, for example, he starts out to build his own villa in 1885-86, which is basically a Palladian villa on the left. And on the right, something like, how many years is that later? 17 years later. Yeah? We're in this together, you know? Yeah. 17 years later, he builds his second villa just next to the first one. He sells the first one and builds his new villa, and you can see where he comes from, where he goes to. But we'll get closer to this then later on. Just one example for work by his pupil, which Frank Lloyd Wright might have been able to see. It's right downtown next to the House Without Eyebrows, which was not built then, 1901 or 2, by Max Fabiani, an architect who came from Trieste to Vienna. Trieste was our harbor then in the Mediterranean. And you can tell how much he's influenced by Wagner. For example, one aspect that Wagner always asks for in architecture, that you have to betonen, to emphasize the horizontals and the verticals. And then interesting, the bay window is nothing Viennese. This comes from the Anglo-Saxon world to Vienna. I love this detail here, which is basically an I-beam, an exposed I-beam. And then he just adds this little gilded decoration onto it. Or another example of work of one of his pupils, Josef Patnik. Have you been to Prague? So you might have seen some of his work up in the castle area. There's little things like fountains and decorations in the gardens of the palace, and maybe one of his most wonderful works from the 20s is a church he did. What is it called? Forgot the name. If you go back to Prague one day, you should look at this church. It's the only Patnik church, so you can find it. And so he is a pupil of Wagner. He works for something 10 years in Vienna. Then the monarchy falls apart. He goes back to his homeland, to Ljubljana, which is the capital of Slovenia today. I always mix up Slovakia and Slovenia. It's Slovenia. And really becomes the major architect in Ljubljana. And in the 20s then, he is called to Prague by Masaryk, the first president of the new country, Czechoslovakia, and also to teach in Prague. So he builds this house in 1903, 1905 in Vienna, the Zacherl house. The Zacherl family got rich because one of the Zacherls went to then Persia and found out that in Persia there was a bush that grew in the desert that they used against fleas. And so Zacherl created the flea powder imperium, made lots of money with it. And so thanks to the flea powder, we have this piece of architecture. And, And he asks, Patnik asks Franz Metzner to do the sculptural decoration. And that's the Franz Metzner Frank Lloyd Wright admired when he was in Vienna. So it's this is terracotta, this decoration. And I can sense why he admired his work, because it's this kind of, I don't know how to describe it. It becomes very geometric, the sculpture. It's like for the Imperial Gardens, things that come on later on. But to me also it's something like nearly proto-fascist, this kind of sculpture. Again, it's this monumentality that can be dangerous. Also, to me, there is Vienna 1900 was rediscovered in the 1970s by the postmodern designers and architects. And they explain it also, why. They say that Viennese design and architecture in Vienna 1900 is the only culture that can combine function and feeling. And so, to me, what's very typical about Viennese design, and we'll see it later on, is there's some kind of a very strong ambiguity. And that's an aspect of postmodern design also. And it's very often that you don't know what you're dealing with. And we're very good in this, you know. We're also a Catholic culture, so you never know what you get. And we thrive on it. And to me, without ambiguity, there's no possibility. And without possibility, there's no creativity. And in this sense, for example, what to me, there's one detail which shows it, is this here, you know? How this is just a surface, and it's emphasizing the surface, but not the volume, the space. And how this just ends here, and then this sits on it. And then by 1902, Wagner changes style. This kind of Art Nouveau decoration, which we could see on the early apartment buildings, is gone, and he finds these very sober geometric forms. And one of the first pieces of, you cannot really call it architecture, it's really a shop front. And the interior of this, it was the offices of a news agency. He designs right downtown. Today it's Kärntnerstraße. It's the most important shopping street in Vienna that leads to the cathedral. And it's the first facade just made out of aluminum in Vienna in 1902. Again, you're much further ahead here with aluminum, with, for example, the staircase in the Monadnock building, which is, I think, 20 years earlier. It's 80s, no? Huh? Is it? 18? 1891. So it's just 10 years earlier. And he designs also the furniture for that news agency. And again, really, it's just the bare minimum that you need to do a table. And again, to me, this is about tradition again. This table could also, it's the basic idea of a table with a trestle table, or what do you call it? Trestle table. And if it's made out of wrought iron, for example, the center part, it could be a Spanish table from the 17th century. It's the same type. And that's what's so amazing about Wagner. He creates the prototypes for so many things in modern. Like he designs the modern bank, the modern church, the modern apartment buildings, the modern villa, and so on. And it's not about fashion with him, not about changing fashions, just for the sake of redesigning something new. And again, that's why he's the hero for Adolf Loos. Or by 1902, 1904, his church in the mental hospital of Steinhof was finished. It's just outside Vienna. It's maybe half an hour from the city center. Frank Lloyd Wright might have seen this, and that really created an uproar because a church doesn't look like that. This looks more like a Hindu temple or something. And well, I want to point out also the sculpture up there, the two saints by a Viennese sculptor called Szymkowicz. And again, you have this boxy appearance of the sculpture. And iconographically, this is something completely new. Saints sitting in a club chair. Huh? Huh? Or the inside. I mean, if you imagine what churches looked like before, they were dark, serious, not cheerful. And maybe his masterwork is the Austrian Postal Savings Bank, which he won the competition in 1903, and he built this from 1904 to 1906. And in a way, it's also something like an architecture parlante, a speaking architecture, because it looks like a coffre-fort, a strong box. Also, very, very conscious use of materials. The base is granite, then you have white marble, and up there, which you cannot really see, it's black glass. And especially, it was a very inexpensive building. He was extremely concerned when designing this building that the maintenance costs were low. And so, for example, he doesn't use brass for the handles because you have to clean brass. It's aluminum. Then for the, we'll see that. Just the entrance hall. Again, another Viennese sculptor, Richard Luksch, 1906. And then the great banking hall inside. So he uses linoleum for the floors, for example. An inexpensive, easy to maintain and clean material. But really, that's his genius, that these inexpensive materials never look cheap, the way he uses it. For example, here, I'm always fascinated. It's like a runner made out of aluminum. So he could have framed the runner, but he runs it through the grid of the floor, which is terrazzo. And then in the center, these are glass bricks so that the daylight can go 2 floors deep down to the mail distribution offices and the safety deposit boxes. The color scheme is gray, black, and white, and silver. And when you're in this space, it's not cold, it's warm, the atmosphere. Just 2 more details. This is the ventilation system in the banking hall, or a piece of furniture he designs for the banking hall. It's a stool made out of bent wood, and it's really stripped down to the most basic. These are 5 bent wood frames screwed together. The seat, this is Sperrholz, is plywood. Is plywood. The only decoration is this slit in the middle so that you can lift it, and then the holes, I don't know, it's maybe ventilation. And that's where the bent wood frames are screwed together. And then, you know, you could say this is not very honest to cover up the screws, but you could also say that it's psychological. He explains that's where it's happening. He puts aluminum caps over it. It's the same system he uses on the facade, where those marble plaques are screwed onto the facade. It's a brick building. And he screws on these marble plaques and then covers them with aluminum caps on the facade. Now, out of these pupils of after Otto Wagner, the next generation splits into 2 different directions in trying to reach the modern expression, modern formal expression in daily life. One group is the group of the secessionist artists, and the other one, it's not really a group, it's the Lonely Wolf, Adolf Loos. And these are 2 completely different worlds. The secessionists, the main difference between the 2 is that the secessionists take an old content and want to give it a new dress. So they're looking for a new style. While Loos questions the content, is not looking for a style. He says we need a new human being. Huh? And that's why Loos really leads the way into modernism. It's all about how you can become an individual. If you really want to break it down to the lowest common denominator, the secessionist way, and that's Hoffmann and Moser and the Wiener Werkstätte, it's a consumatory way. You consume the modern style. You can become modern by buying something modern. While Loos, it's an emancipatory way. And that's why it's much more difficult to sell, because you have to do it yourself, you know. So the secessionists, they form as an artistic group in 1897, and by 1898 they built their own exhibition building. And I chose especially this old photograph so that you realize what this must have meant for the Viennese. It's like an alien landed in Vienna, because you can see how it's really like a Balkan scene, you know, here with this marketplace. Very important with the secessionists is color. That's what also ties it to postmodernism then. It's a reoccurring thing to me in the history of the humankind. When we have big changes, cultural changes, the notion of function is being redefined, and then feelings become part of function and very important. And when feeling becomes important, color becomes important. And we have that for the first time in the Rococo period. That's the first time that really feelings become one. You have it in music, for example. Before that, the different movements of music are according to dances, which is really a dance. You follow a step. It has nothing to do with individual expressions. And it's sarabande, menuet, or whatever. And then by the 1720s, 30s, it changes, and the musical movements get names of feelings like adagio, allegro. And color, for the first time, really, you have green, white, pink, white, blue, white furniture in the Rococo. Next time is turn of the century, and then again in the postmodern period. So you have this white building with the gold decoration, and then some of the ornaments are green and strong blue. Joseph Maria Olbrich, the architect of this, he was a pupil of Wagner also, and it's a multi-purpose exhibition hall. The inside, just the entrance was decorated. The main exhibition hall changed with each exhibition. Where I started out and didn't follow up is the Secessionists bring to Vienna the idea of the unity of the arts. It comes through the arts and crafts movement from England, which means that they abolished the hierarchy between what they call then, you're not allowed to say this today, high art and low art, which is fine arts and the decorative arts and the applied arts. And it's part of this whole idea of bringing artistic expression back into daily life, and you only can do that through abolishing this hierarchy. And Loos is completely opposed to that. He says art and function are two different things. They have not, and it's really a sign of unkultur, unculturedness, of really the extreme of being uncultured is to combine both of this. And out of this idea or this creed of the unity of the arts, the idea of the total work of art emerges. And that's one of the big achievements of the Secessionists, to realize this total work of art in any aspect of their work, starting with the publication, the Ver Sacrum, which means the Holy Spring, the posters, the tickets, the entrance tickets, the letterheads, any aspect. Yeah, just to show you what this evolution meant. Two pieces of furniture of the same year, 1899, Joseph Hoffmann, a pupil of Wagner on the right hand. Originally, this piece of furniture was green. And at one point, the owner just couldn't stand the green anymore, and it was too present. And really the first piece of modern furniture in Vienna, this silver cabinet from Otto Wagner's own dining room, which the apartment was in one of those two apartment buildings from 1898, 1899. And Wagner also says, you know, you always have to develop the form out of construction. And what this is, it's really just a frame panel construction, that's all. And you have the panels here, and again, he adds this is mother of pearl, just to, it's psychological, he doesn't need them. It's just to show this is where it's fixed into the frame. Hoffmann, the Secession was founded by these young artists because they realized that Vienna was far behind in Europe in having a modern formal expression. And they say, okay, it exists in France, it exists in England, in Germany, in Belgium. We need to expose the Viennese public to these modern achievements abroad. And so they create this exhibition building, exhibit those things, sell things very successfully. And so first they depend really on this foreign influence, and they say, we want to create a modern Austrian style for the bourgeoisie. That's their creed. And so you can see with this piece of Hoffmann furniture how this still influenced by the curvilinear international Art Nouveau. And this piece of furniture is an individual, no? And it's really, as Lowe says, it's not the object who needs to be an individual, it's you who needs to be an individual. Huh? So they're looking for an Austrian style. And why Austrian? Not out of nationalism in the sense like the Czech look for a Czech style, the Hungarians for Hungarian style, the Catalans for a Catalan style with Gaudi, or Saarinen in Finland for a Finnish style. It's always, you know, cultures that are under the dominance of another culture. They are looking for their own national style at the period. Well, Vienna is the center of a multinational style, cannot create an Austrian style out of nationalism, but out of individualism. Because for them, for this young generation, the eclectic style has no individuality. It is exchangeable, and also it's a formal expression that uses styles of a different society, of a court and aristocratic society. So they say we need to, and also it's important to have a distinct Austrian style so that you can compete with a product internationally that distinguishes itself from other countries. The French do the same thing. I mean, the French don't have a problem to know that they are the Grande Nation, but they also look to create a distinctive French style at that time because they are under enormous pressure from Germany. Germany, with the foundation of the Reich, the unification of Germany, for the first time they become a military world power and economically, and also having colonies for the first time. And the French really feel dwarfed and threatened. And they say, we need to go back to the times where France was dictating their styles internationally. So they ask themselves, when was that? And they define it with the period of Louis XV, with the Rococo. And that's why the French Art Nouveau looks like that. Well, the Austrians ask themselves, when did the bourgeoisie have for the first time its own style? They define it with the Biedermeier period. Today, and that's why the Viennese Art Nouveau, you cannot call it Art Nouveau. The Viennese formal expression from 1900 looks geometric and square. Today we know that Biedermeier has nothing to do with the bourgeoisie, because to be able to create a style, you need a voice in society. And the bourgeoisie had no voice then. It's very, very late. It's only from 1860 on that the bourgeoisie has a voice in public in Austria. Very, very late. And it's also the same period then that, for example, the Jewish population of the empire gets for the first time nearly full civil rights. And that's how also then the Jewish high bourgeoisie, they became the most important sponsors of that new art, because it was also a social vehicle to be noticed in society. I mean, it's the same thing today, or it was before. Art is always a vehicle. I don't know if you know this book by, Tim Bonihady. It's called The Good Living Street. Have you heard of this? It's the family, the history of the Gallia family. Was a Jewish family in Vienna, and they had to emigrate in 1938 to Australia. And you might be familiar with the portrait of Hermine Gallia, which Klimt painted. And Hoffmann designed the whole apartment, and he writes in this book very blandly, no, the commission to Klimt for the portrait was the way to have a position in society. So just to show you, a typical piece of Biedermeier furniture, extremely pared down, functional, geometric, and the table by Hoffmann from 1905 for the Koller family, a Jewish family in Vienna. The most important realization of a total work of art as an exhibition was the so-called Beethoven Exhibition in 1902, the 14th Secession exhibition, where all the arts worked together to create this exhibition. Complete exhibition design, and we also have this long tradition in Vienna, it's a Baroque tradition, that the ephemeral is, we express, or the court expressed itself especially with ephemeral events. It's not like, it functions completely different from the French court, where the French court represents, represents with the help of the apartment. Because the French king is always public and private at the same time, while the Habsburg ruler only dines maybe once or twice in public, and there's no lever and coucher in Vienna. The Habsburg emperor is completely removed from the subjects. So to be in public, it's either with the help of an opera, a mess, a tournament, a ballet. And that's I think that's why until today, the performing arts are much, much stronger in Austria than the fine arts. So this exhibition is being designed around the Beethoven statue by Klinger that was just finished. And Beethoven was somehow celebrated at the time as the artist, the suffering artist for humanity, to save humanity. In a way, it's the topic also of the arts and crafts movement, that you save the world through artistic expression. And Klimt designed for that exhibition his Beethoven Frieze in a room that Hoffmann designed for it. It's up here. Oops, I thought, yeah, it's just, you get an idea. It shows the suffering humanity that is being led by the Golden Knight to salvation through the arts. And it ends this frieze with the last movement of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. That's why he designed the Beethoven Frieze, because of the Beethoven statue. And it ends with this kissed the whole world. And Gustav Mahler performed in the exhibition then the last movement of the Ninth Symphony. It's really a complete, total work of art. And to go back, Hoffmann designing the exhibition, this is one of the entrances, and he designs this overdoor decoration, which some people think it's the first piece of abstract art, this relief, and others think it's just decoration. There's a big discussion going on this. Another, to me, one of the most successful examples of an exhibition design at the Secession was the 1903 exhibition devoted solely to the work of, what's his name? Yeah, Gustav Klimt. What's so new about it? White walls. Today we take it for granted. Still in 1907, when Austria exhibited in Venice at the Biennale, and they exhibited paintings on white walls, it created enormous scandal in 1907 still. This was designed by a painter, Koloman Moser. And to me, he's very, very fascinating figure in connection with this idea of the unity of the arts. You have an artist, a painter, that ventures from the two-dimensional canvas into the three-dimensional space and objects. And so what's so fascinating for me with this space is he just dissects the space. He creates 4 canvases by framing the walls. It's like taking it apart, the space. And like here for this is the portrait of Mrs. Knips, an early Klimt portrait. The way he positions it, and the wall becomes like the matting for the painting. So through the sponsoring or the artistic sponsoring of the secession, and especially through the teachings now of these young artists that were the founding members of the secession, like Joseph Hoffmann, architect, Koloman Moser, painter, who became professors at the School of Applied Arts. This new style can spread now. And it's amazing, Hoffmann, he was 28 when he was appointed full professor at the School of Applied Arts. So just one example, you have this at the Art Institute, you must have seen it, the green version of it. It's by Jutta Sicker. Typical, you know, women then, they were allowed to work in ceramics, glass, and textiles. Huh? That's female, furniture is male. Huh? And anyway, they also could not attend painting classes at the academy because of the nude, they needed to go to private schools. And just to be able to realize this total work of art, like Hoffmann then designing silver pieces, the mustard pot, or Moser designing glass objects. And they were very good also, this Moser and Hoffmann, in helping their students to get jobs, in putting them together with the industry. And the forward-looking industries, they were embracing these new talents and seeing the chances on the market. These were like the Bentwood firm of J&J Cohn, who realized, for example, the stool of Wagner for the Postal Savings Bank, or then the firm of Bakalovich, who ordered this kind of vases, or then this is Josef Böck, and the firm of Backhausen. This is a piece of textile by Hoffmann. Now to show you somehow the differences between the two worlds of Loos and Hoffmann. So Loos, of course, is completely opposed to the idea of the total work of art. He creates his little story to explain why, and it's called The Story of the Poor Rich Man. The rich man orders a home from an architect. Architect designs the house, the interiors, the clothes, the jewelry, everything. Rich man gets a gift of a vase, puts it in his house. Rich man goes and buys some slippers, walks around with his slippers in the house. Architect comes to visit, sees the vase, the slippers, says, "No way, you cannot do this to my work of art." So, out. And like that, then the rich man becomes a poor rich man because he serves the work of art instead of the house, which should serve him. And that's where this idea comes in, you know, the division between function and art. And I especially chose those two examples because it's the same symmetric layout for the room that Hoffmann and that Loos uses. 2 cupboards, a double bed, 2 night tables. Same thing here. But what does Loos do? That's his own bedroom. You don't see any of the furniture. It disappears. And also, the idea of laws, the ultimate idea of the modern is the abolishment of furniture. He writes an article in the 20s, he says, the abolition of furniture. I can feel for it, you know, because the older I get, I don't want to be surrounded anymore. I mean, I love furniture. It's my profession, you know, to write about it and think about it. And the older I get, I don't want to be surrounded by interesting furniture anymore. I want to be left alone. Huh? Huh? As you can tell, I want to speak, not the furniture. Also interesting, the design process of when Loos draws a space, or Hoffmann. This is for the Wittgenstein family. This is for the cousin of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. So Loos really, he defines the space. It's about volume, it's about space, not about an individual decorative element. Or for example here, this is maybe the first total work of art that Joseph Hoffmann creates with the help of the Wiener Werkstätte. The Wiener Werkstätte is founded in 1903, so that Hoffmann and Moser have the possibility to execute the total works of art independent from manufacturers or independent craftsmen. So they create this entity, the Wiener Werkstätte, where they house all the different artisans they need to create the total work of art under one roof. It's based on the idea of the Guild of Handicrafts in England. But the difference, again, between the Guild of Handicrafts and the Wiener Werkstätte is that in the Guild of Handicrafts, the artisans designed also, while in the Wiener Werkstätte it's Hoffmann and Moser or other artists. It's this moral dimension is not important for the Wiener Werkstätte or for the secessionist artists. It's a much more authoritarian system. I mean, it's a Catholic culture, of course. And did I want to say? And it's also interesting that, okay, they admire the ideas of Morris, the secessionists, they admire Ashby and so on, but who becomes the real hero for the Viennese, for the secessionists? It's Mackintosh. And Mackintosh is not part of the arts and crafts movement, really. And I think it's a basic difference between this Catholic and Protestant culture, where one of the important creeds of the arts and crafts movement is truth to material. And material in itself has an artistic quality, while in the Catholic world, the material itself has no artistic value. It's only through the artistic transformation. Amen. Okay? You want more? Yes. This is the first total work of art that Hoffmann and Moser create with the help of the Wiener Werkstätte. The Wiener Werkstätte, that was really a body that it's like Louis Vuitton of the period. They, of course, wanted to give the good form to the shape to everybody, but it completely depended on private sponsorship. It was extreme luxury, this production. Why did I say this now? No. So they designed it's a sanatorium outside Vienna for the Zuckerkandel family, Jewish family again, Bertha Zuckerkandl, the sister-in-law of the sponsor of this sanatorium. She was one of the leading defenders of the secessionist movements as an art critic also. And her sister was married to the brother of Clemenceau. It's a very interesting combination, connections there. So Hoffmann and Moser, they designed every detail. Also interestingly, this is one of the first reinforced concrete buildings. So what you see here, this is the reinforced concrete structure. But of course, it's been decorated with stenciling by Hoffmann. And down here, this is a little bit unfair to compare, but because it's 1899. It's maybe it's the first public space that Loos designs in Vienna. It's the Café Museum, which is completely bare of any decoration. That's why the Viennese immediately called it the Café Nihilismus. And in a way, it's the first concept of a redesign. If we look at the two chairs, the chair that Hoffmann designs for the Sanatorium Purkersdorf, he completely designs, and you can really, when you apply art historical techniques or whatever you call it, you can explain, okay, this is a chair designed by Hoffmann. While here, it's impossible. You cannot say this is a chair by Loos or by anybody else. What Loos does here, he takes the typical coffee house chair, which is a bentwood chair, and just changes certain details of it. Like he gives it a saddle seat, which he brings from England to Vienna. Then he changes the dimensions here where he doesn't need it, and he gives it another color, this red stained color. And so, for example, what Loos also says, the worst thing he can say about Hoffmann is that man who designs cutlery. And by that he means this architect who designs cutlery. Because for Loos, the task of an architect is very clearly defined. The architect is responsible for the architecture, creating the space, the shelter, and for the interiors, he's helping the people to furnishing it, to tell them where to buy things, what to buy. But it's not the task of an architect to design furniture or objects. And he goes that far that he says it's a complete waste of energy, of creative energy, to redesign something that has already found in the course of history its perfect shape. So that's why, for example, Loos uses a lot of reproduction furniture, like Chippendale chairs, because he says the Chippendale chair is the perfect chair to use. Just again, just the position. Same year, Joseph Hoffmann designing the dining room at the Palais Stockler in Brussels with the mosaic frieze by Klimt. Hoffmann designing even the tooled leather, the carpet, every detail. And while here, Loos only designs the wall paneling, that's it. Because he says whatever is connected to the wall, it's the duty of the architect. Huh? I mean, this, yes, what's modern about this, no? Modern is that it leaves you alone. Or another juxtaposition of the two worlds of Hoffmann and Loos. Oops. Loos's own apartment where he creates this Ingelnook. Again, Hoffmann also the Ingelnook for the Bauhaus. Again, England becomes a very, very important source of inspiration, and especially for Loos, who traveled to this country in, I think, 1891. His uncle was a tailor in Philadelphia, And then Loos also in the course of this trip, I think he stayed 2 or 3 years in America. He came to see the World Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. And I had a moment of revelation when I visited the Glessner House for the first time. I thought, now I know where Loos comes from. And Loos, for example, in opposition to the Secession, who publishes the Versacrum, the artistic magazine, he publishes also his magazine, which only has 2 issues. Das andere, it's called, The Other, and it has a subtitle. And it says, a leaflet to introduce Abendländisch, Western culture into Austria. And by that he means the Anglo-Saxon culture. Again, to show you these 2 different worlds, there are 2 camps, the Secessionists with Klimt and the Wiener Werkstätte and Hoffmann. The patrons of the Wiener Werkstätte are the patrons of Klimt, while the patrons of Loos are the patrons of Kokoschka. And it's with Kokoschka, really, it's about the inner world, not the outer world. And even Kokoschka, for example, he said, I'm painting the people because, he said, why do you show people when you paint them, the portraits? I mean, they don't look like that. He says, I paint them how they're going to look in 10 years. Huh? Difficult to sell, no? This is a nice example for this ambiguity I was talking about. If you look at the chair, and there's also this, you never know with the Viennese, it's a space or a surface. And here, it's a three-dimensional fauteuil, and you have to define it yourself. Out of this flat surface, you have to create the chair, the fauteuil. Frank Lloyd Wright might have been able to see the Kärntner bar or the American bar of Loos, one of the few intact spaces of Loos that still exist today in Vienna. It's a wonderful space. It's a tiny little space. It's half the size of this auditorium. And the way he's able to enlarge is by introducing these mirrors up here. And that's how he enlarges the space, because the space ends here. And since the mirrors are up there, you cannot see yourself in the mirrors. So it really expands. And it's wonderful use of materials, for example, this coffered ceiling, that's marble. It's veneered marble. And this is agate, which is lit from behind. It's really a must to have a drink there when you come. In 1903, Hoffmann and Moser, they found the Wiener Werkstätte, but they only could found it with the help of a very potent financial backer, which was Fritz Werndorfer. He came from a Jewish textile manufacturing family, and Fritz Werndorfer really, he spends his whole fortune. He believes in the secession, he believes in the Wiener Werkstätte. He spends the whole family fortune on it until the family has enough in 1913 and says, off to America. And he dies in America. No. Oops. So, even before founding the Wiener Werkstätte, a year before, he asks Hoffmann to design the dining room. He asked Mackintosh to design the music room, and he asks Moser to design the gallery space. That's the dining room, which again, we have this display with the plane and the space, how it's all surface, and then here by putting up this frame that comes out of the wall like that around to frame the cupboard that is set into the wall, he creates space. Or for example, the windows, these are windows like in a train compartment. You can lower them so that the surface stays intact. That if you open them, they don't, how do you say, protrude into the space. So with these leather things, you can lower them into the wall. Or if you look at the chairs, this, of course, it's not a cantilevered chair because it still has 4 legs, but the way this sticks out, can you see what I mean? Oh, good. We only have black and white photographs, but color is very, very important. For example, this is basically black and white with white marble here, black and white marble on the floor. This is a carpet, a gray carpet. And then the walls up here, this is rough stucco, which is silvered, shiny. When I was working, it's also interesting, when I was working on, I did a Hoffmann show at the Neue Galerie, recreating 4 rooms of his. And in a way, I don't believe in period rooms because you can only make it wrong because you always see it with your eyes. And in 10 years, you see the date when it was made. So I was forced to do period rooms. But the interesting experience is that suddenly I understood how Hoffmann worked. Because working just from these photographs and without color, and you have to recreate it. And if you fail in one detail, the whole thing falls apart. It's so refined how those things how do you say? Or relate to each other. And the other interesting thing was because we had to find the original floor plans and so on, and realizing it then, those rooms are much smaller than what you see. That was really like a shock experience. That's the gallery space that Moser designs. It's black, blue, and silver, the space. And here, Mackintosh really was very, very influential to the Viennese. When he exhibited in 1900 at the Secession, again, it was for the Viennese like, what has descended on Vienna here? But they really admired him. And especially for his creativity and just for this energy to realize his artistic ideas. And for example, what I think Moser gets from Mackintosh is, and also Hoffmann, is the way because this is a space, a 19th century space, this was changed inside. So what they do is they put their space into the old space. And how do they do this? By introducing this horizon, which unites the furniture and the architecture. And this horizon runs through the window. Can you see here? The curtain rail. And Mackintosh does the same thing in his home and studio. Uh, 1903, the Wiener Werkstätte being founded, and by 1904 they get their own premises, which Hoffmann and Moser designed then. Like this is the sales rooms. Or then just an overview of what they designed: the lighting, the furniture, cutlery, teapots, dishes, postcards, textiles. The only venue where they were financially successful was postcards and textiles. Because my explanation is they are independent from the total work of art, huh? And also affordable. It's really so refined, the design of Hoffmann. These are the library stairs for the Wittgenstein family. It's oak, And what he loves to do is to stain oak black and then rub color into the grains of the wood. Most of the examples we know is white, the black oak with the white in the veneer. And this is, here he rubbed yellow color into the grains, but if you use yellow, then you cannot use silver fittings. So he has to use brass fittings. Okay, yeah. Moser, and I'm fascinated with this vase, for example, is, again, I told you, Moser, the painter who comes from the canvas, from the two-dimensional, he creates a three-dimensional object, and he combines two planes, sticks them together, and it becomes three-dimensional. Or that, also the use of basic geometric shapes, like with this lamp by Moser, a cone. Extremely expensive, but you know, you need to be able to sell this because this was considered a cheap surface, a hammered surface. One more? Yeah, this is fascinating to me at least. a chair by Moser for the Mautner family, another Jewish family that assimilated by converting to Protestantism. And the fascinating thing here is that how Moser, the painter, exposes the structure of the chair. Normally, this is being covered with a textile or leather. And if we go back to the Biedermeier period, there's a tradition for this. And in the ultimate modernist piece of furniture, Corbusier, which this is so often celebrated as the first piece of seating furniture exposing the structure. It's the facade of the Sanatorium Purkersdorf, the first building with the flat roof in Vienna, not with a hipped roof, 1904. It's a rough stucco surface, and then each facade is framed with blue and white tiles. It's like a checkerboard in blue and white. So in a way, it's the same thing that Moser did with the Klimt exhibition, that you dissect the building, and what you see is planes. And very interesting, this here, it's so ambiguous. There's a terrace up here, and the parapet of the terrace is the facade. So it's surface and space at the same plane and space at the same time. Or to me, this is like a postmodern thing. It's the back entrance. You have a pillar, and then it's a porte cochere, and then the roof of the porte cochere rests on the pillars. But it's like, what do you call that? It's yeah, it's coffered, and this is like the capital for the pillar, but it's not at the same time. And that's very, very Viennese. Let's see. No, I want to show you something else. Like here, this is a late Hoffmann building. It was just started to be built when Frank Lloyd Wright was in Vienna. They started building in 1909. It's a facade that is made out of poured concrete, the whole decoration. Because the patron who ordered it was a builder that worked in poured concrete. This is the same builder who built the Sanatorium Purkersdorf, the Ast family. And this is fascinating. Like here, this is the wall. It's fluted, but at the same time it could be eine Lisene. It's not a pillar. A pillar is something three-dimensional, no? Yes. And this is just flat, what you call it? A pilaster. So, in a way, it could be interpreted as pilasters or as wall. And then again, this rests like a capital on it. Yeah. It's like this is like Michael Graves, but it's Hoffman. Again, the tabletop becomes the capital for the pillars. Or with this piece here, you would think it's upside down, the proportions, that this should be the base for it. And it's a capital, and it's not a capital. But then he designs the Ionic capitals here, Kirch. Or then the Austrian Pavilion for Cologne in 1914, where this is then an extreme form, the pillars and at the same time the wall. Sorry for being too long. It's just to give you an introduction into what's going on in Vienna at the time. Thank you for your patience.